All right, so good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our fifth session of this round of the Forage Forum Fridays here on January 21st. So we're excited to have you all with us today. I apologize, I've got a little bit of a head cold going on right now, but I'm excited here today to have Mark Kepler. He's our Fulton County Ag and Natural Resource Educator here with Purdue Extension. He's worked closely with our speakers today to bring us a great presentation, so we're excited about this. As we get started, I'm going to post a link in the chat box. If you could complete that at the end of today's discussion, we would greatly appreciate that. And then I'll also be putting up a poll towards the end if you could complete. And so we just appreciate this feedback and this information. So with no further ado, I will hand it over to you, Mark, and let you introduce our speakers for today.
Well, I always do appreciate the opportunity to work across the state lines, and we came up with this topic of forage fertilization and the issues of the fertilizer prices that we're dealing with right now. And so we invited a couple of educators. I don't know if that's your names now. Yeah, you are over in Ohio to help us out with this. And I appreciate you guys working with us. I don't know, Christopher Zoller and Jason Hartschuh. I get it right? Hartschuh? You can come on.
Not quite. Had to get the mouse to the right place.
Yeah.
Hartschuh, like your heart in your shoe.
Hartschuh.
Yep.
Well, anyway, we're going to talk about forage fertilization. Jason, I don't know who's on first with this one, so we'll go from there. Let you guys have it.
Okay, thank you, Mark, for the introduction. I'm on first, and then Jason will follow up. I'm Chris Zoller, Extension Educator in Tuscarawas County. For those of you unfamiliar with that, Tuscarawas, first of all, is an Indian word for open mouth, referring to the open mouth of the river. And it's in East Central Ohio. We're about 2 hours east of Columbus, and Interstate 77 runs north and south through the county. So we're about 80 miles south of Cleveland and 80 miles north of Marietta, Ohio. So pretty diverse agriculture, a lot of livestock, dairy cattle, beef cattle, forages, and also grain crops. So appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I was talking with one of my colleagues this morning who's a Purdue graduate, and he was happy to hear that we were working with Purdue, and he was a bit upset that Purdue apparently lost in basketball last night. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and move on, and again, appreciate the opportunity to be here. So some of the topics we'll discuss here this afternoon, the fertilizer situation, maybe give you a little bit of background as to why fertilizer prices are the way they are, talk about soil sampling and lime applications, what to do with those limited dollars, and touch on some utilization of manure on forage crops, recommendations for nitrogen on small grains, and then finish up with a discussion about sulfur on alfalfa. So, we all know that fertilizer prices are high, and what are some reasons for that? Got some information here from our colleagues at University of Illinois in their Farm Doc program. This was back in the fall, looking at some of the reasons why we have the situation that we have today. If we remember back in September, there was a hurricane, that was Hurricane Ida, that hit, and it disrupted some anhydrous ammonia plants and operations in the state of Louisiana. And so because of those damages, there were supply disruptions there. Natural gas prices have been increasing, and those are correlated with nitrogen fertilizer prices. And so we're seeing some impacts because of that. We also know that fertilizer prices are correlated with the price of corn. And so we know what that corn price has been doing. It is high. And so when we have higher corn prices, those fertilizer prices tend to increase as well. And then everyone, no matter whether it's farm or non-farm, seems to be dealing in some respect with a supply chain disruption. And so we have the supply chain disruptions, and then this continuing, lingering, ongoing pandemic and labor issues. All these things combined are factors that have contributed to this fertilizer situation that we find ourselves in today. I called a couple retailers just here locally in my county just recently and asked for some prices. I don't know what you're seeing in Indiana, but these are the prices that we have here locally in the last couple of weeks. 28 between 565 and just over 600. 1030 is in that mid $800 range. DAP in the high 800s, pushing 900, and potash again 788 to 840. So generally historically high fertilizer prices, and take a look here and see, maybe get some ideas to what these prices might do into the future. I've talked to lots of folks trying to read up on some things, and it's hard to get anybody to really commit to what fertilizer prices are going to do. We have seen a little bit of softening in price increases, the pace, the rate of those increases. So hopefully that's a good thing. But there is an organization called the International Fertilizer Association, and they have a fertilizer outlook. It's called their medium-term fertilizer outlook. And so they looked at the period from 2021 through 2025. What are the expectations? What has fertilizer done, and what do they expect it to do over that time period? And so when we compare 19 and 20 against 20 and 21, there were increases in each of the nutrients. So nitrogen, that demand increased just over 4%. There was a 7% increase in phosphorus demand and just over 6% in potash demand. Now, as I said, that demand is expected to continue to grow, but at a slower pace. And so hopefully these prices don't escalate like we've seen recently. Also, part of that report from that IFA, looking at different time periods, what the numbers of metric tons was used, and what some of the expectations or forecasts are for the future. In that 2018-19 period, just over 187 metric tons of fertilizer. Looking at 19 and 20 at that time, the estimate was 188. 2021 forecasting a total of just over 198, and then up to that 25-26 time period, again another increase up to 208 metric tons. So again, these are projections, forecasts, and always with projections and forecasts, there are lots of factors that can contribute to those, and that's what the bottom of that slide shows you there, is that where it says uncertainties, there are lots of those. And so, you know, they mentioned things like global economic environment, what happens with the weather, and commodity prices, fertilizer prices, the biofuels. That's been a factor in corn prices, which has been a factor in fertilizer prices as well. You know, what sorts of government policies might come along, and then recycling organic nutrient sources. So again, we're looking out several years into the future on what these might be. But at this point, this association, this is kind of their forecast for what we might see in terms of consumption and use. So as we think about the situation we're in today, and this holds true regardless of the price of fertilizer, but I think it's important to get back to the basics. And the basics are soil sampling and testing. We need to get a baseline, establish a baseline as to where we are with those fertility levels in the soils and in those fields that we have. And keep in mind that the accuracy of that information, it's as good as what you put in. What you put in is what you're going to get out. And so doing a good job of sampling is critically important. And I think this kind of drives home the point that a 1-inch soil probe represents 6.6 square inches, while an acre represents 6 million square inches. So we're using a soil probe that's small, and we're trying to get a representative sample of what that field looks like. And so each of those cores that we collect, we want to make sure that they're done randomly, done properly, well mixed, and sent to the lab for an analysis. Generally speaking, we don't want to sample anything greater than 25 acres. If we have fields that are larger than that, try to break those down into those less than 25 acre areas. It's important too to, again, going back to the basics, considering the field variability. I know in my part of the state, we've got, we're in that unglaciated area. So we've got some hills, we've got some low spots, rolling terrain. And so there may be wet areas in some of those low areas, depending upon our soil type. We do have a lot of heavy clays. Along the riverbanks, of course, is our well-drained soils, but those wet areas can be a factor. So if those tend to stay wet or they produce differently, maybe we sample those separately from the rest of an area. Slopes is another issue to be concerned about. Is productivity different on the slope as compared to the low spots, as compared to those areas up on top of the hill? And as I mentioned, soil type, if we have a lot of variability across a field, we may want to think about identifying where those soil types change and separate those and sample those differently. If you're not familiar with it, the Tri-State Fertilizer recommendations was recently revised and updated. You can get a copy of that, and sampling depths and recommendations in that bulletin are based on that 8-inch sampling depth. In terms of timing, we can soil sample any time of the year, really, but it's best to avoid that growing period where those plants are actively growing because they're pulling nutrients and we're harvesting nutrients off of that. So spring and fall are typically the times of year when we want to do this. It's important that soil be dry when we send that to the lab. And the important thing here is consistency. So if you sample in the spring every time you sample. If you sample in the fall, do it in the fall each and every time. Again, maintain that consistency in that sampling. Frequency is generally, we like every 3 to 4 years, you should be getting a rotation so that each of those time periods, you're sampling different fields. And then Purdue does have a bulletin on soil sampling guidelines. If you're not familiar with that, there's a link for that. I would encourage you to reference that. Okay, pH and lime. Sometimes when finances are tight, farmers will say, I'm going to skip on the lime this year and not worry about that. And in our discussions, my recommendation is generally that that's not the place to try to cut spending. That lime is critically important in maintaining soil pH, because when it's in that proper range, in that proper place, those plants are going to uptake nutrients better. They're going to be more accessible. And so encourage folks not to neglect those lime applications. Generally speaking, most of our agricultural crops, we'd like to see that in a 6 to a 6.8 pH range. And there are various sources of liming materials available. It's not uncommon for me to get a phone call from a farmer saying, hey, I've got this really cheap source of lime available. And so we ask, what's the neutralizing power? I don't know, it's just really cheap. Well, if we have to buy more to get the same as agricultural lime, we may not be saving as much money as we think. So understanding what the neutralizing power is of whatever lime source you're using. And then keep in mind that, especially with our forage crops where we're not disking or plowing or doing any sorts of incorporation, when we apply that lime on the surface, it does move slowly through the soil profile, so it's going to take some time. And so when we think about those applications, fall is generally a good time to do that because it does allow some freeze and thaw and allows time for that lime to work its way down through the soil profile. I mentioned the Tri-State Fertilizer recommendations earlier. They do talk about build-up and maintenance phases and 3 kind of assessment periods or definitions. The first assessment is if it's deficient, or the phase we call that is the buildup. And so it's something that's below the critical level. And so how do we correct that? We apply the crop removal rates plus more to build up and get that where it needs to be, and try to do that as quickly as possible. If we're in that assessment range that we call optimal, things are pretty much in a maintenance range. We're just applying nutrients at a crop removal rate. And then finally, the sufficient is where we're above that maintenance level. So we've got more than what the crop needs. There's no reason to fertilize. It's going to be a waste of time and money and nutrients. And the crop just isn't going to benefit anymore from that. Just some critical nutrient levels to keep in mind based on different forages. In terms of soil pH, grasses like to be above that 6.3. Clovers 6.5, as well as alfalfa somewhere in that 6.5 to 6.8 range is generally ideal. For phosphorus on our grasses, 15 parts per million, legumes is 25, and potassium, most of our soils somewhere between 100 and 120 parts per million. Many of you probably have seen this chart, this table. It's a range of pH from 4.5 to 8. And so as we look at our grasses, again, somewhere in that 6 to 6.5 is where we'd like to be. Our alfalfa is somewhere between 6.5 and 7, probably around 6.8 would be ideal. And the reason we like to target those ranges is that if you look at each of those areas in those pH ranges, if we stay there, we get the fungi that's in the soil that's active is available, the bacterias, potassiums, phosphates, all the nutrients that are needed by that plant to grow and do well are in an ideal range for plant uptake. and we minimize any toxic effects from anything in the soil. And this table just shows that the effects of pH on the efficiency of those fertilizers that are applied. So if you've got a pH that's 5.5, you can see the efficiencies of each of those nutrients compared to something that's in a 6 or a 7. So again, as we get that pH where it needs to be and we maintain it, it's much easier for those plants to take those nutrients up and grow well. So just wrap up my section here. Again, lots of different factors are affecting fertilizer price. Many of these things we don't have control over, but you know, we're operating in a global environment. So it's just something we're having to deal with at this point. Really not sure how long this is going to last. I've asked a lot of different folks, you know, what's the future look like? What do you think? No one's really willing to stick their neck out on that question. But if we look at that IFA report, we should see some softening. We're starting to see some softening in demand at this point, but it's important to, again, keep abreast of what's happening. Talked about soil testing. I think it's critically important. It is a basic management function that you can perform. Getting and maintaining that pH to where it needs to be is critically important. And I think it's important too that you talk with your suppliers, find out what supplies they have, when do they expect things to be in, can they give you some idea on price, but just having good open conversations with the folks you're buying these inputs from is going to be important. And having a plan and a backup plan and another backup plan is probably a good idea as well. And then finally, I would encourage you, this may be a good year to do some on-farm research plots and looking at various rates of fertilizer applications and seeing how different applications perform on your farm. If you don't know if you're familiar with the eFields program that we do at Ohio State, but if you're interested in more information about that, you can talk with me. Jason's also heavily involved with that. We can help you discuss if there's some projects you'd like to do on your farm. I think it's a good opportunity to see how things perform in given scenarios on your farm. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason.
All right, thank you, Chris. That's a great lead into what I'm going to discuss here today, which is some of the work we've done on actually here in Ohio. I'm going to start off with a study from Ohio and then pull some data from a study that was actually done in Indiana, along with another one from down in Arizona. Those two were both published by IPNI, the International Plant Nutrition Institute. Looking at fertilizer rates and the importance of fertilization of forage crops. We're going to focus heavily on alfalfa. Towards the end, we will roll in a little bit on some nitrogen management for those cereal grains. I know a lot of growers raising livestock today are raising those cereal grains as a cover crop, harvesting them for forage, and then utilizing that to grow a second crop. So growing 2 crops in 1 year is always an economical decision. So from 2009 to 2012, we did a study here in Ohio. 2009, the alfalfa field was planted. The soil tests were pulled at that time with a group of treatments here that we'll go over. The first thing to note is what the soil tests were, because we were actually, if you go back to Chris's discussion on that recommendation in the tri-state of nutrient levels, this study was put on a deficient field. So the phosphorus was 7.5 parts per million. Based on tri-state, we would actually recommend a minimum of 20 parts per million. If you're going to grow corn and soybeans, 30 to 50 is that maintenance range for alfalfa and wheat. So very deficient in phosphorus, but that phosphorus rate, I guess, would have been Bray P1 because it's based on the old style testing. So 20 parts per million would have been that lower critical level we would have been looking at. And then potassium at 83 parts per million, and that lower critical number is about 120 parts per million where this study was done. So it's put on a deficient field to look at, do we need buildup, how to best manage our fertilizers. The treatments were no fertilizer control, the tri-state recommendation for P and K, and then P and K fertilization just based on crop removal. So we didn't work on building that field up into the maintenance range. We just put on what the crop removed. And then half of crop removal. So that would be in that year where you have limited dollars for fertilizer. What happens if we only put on a balance of P and K at half crop removal? A little bit later, we'll look at why that balance may be critical and not just choosing just potassium or just phosphorus. And then tri-state, so P and K plus flue gas gypsum, and then tri-state plus elemental sulfur. And we'll dive in a little bit more to why sulfur is important towards the end, but we'll see that sulfur was also a critical nutrient here in this study. So what was done, tri-state called for pre-plant 125 pounds of P2O5 and 190 pounds of K2O, and then an annual maintenance rate of about 200 pounds of P2O5 and 300 pounds of K2O. You'll notice here that crop removal, we did apply for crop removal, which was 400 pounds of K2O. There's a recommendation out there, and it's a fairly important one, that we don't apply more than 300 pounds of K2O, either in a year or definitely in a single application. If we have to go over 300 pounds, we need to spread that potassium out into multiple applications, because we can actually burn that growing alfalfa crop due to the high salting, and change some different things going on in that soil biology that we don't want to do. Sulfur that was applied with that tri-state, there was about 250 pounds of sulfur applied with the gypsum, way more than what we really needed, or 75 pounds of elemental sulfur. And the elemental sulfur was just put on in the first year. And we'll get into a bit that flue gas gypsum at 250 pounds. That was based off of the gypsum rate recommendation for soil health improvement, which put on way more sulfur than we really wanted and could have actually potentially caused some problems in the ration and nutritionally. When we look at yield, annual average across all of these trials, definitely stands out here that fertilization is critical if we're below that maintenance level. So annual average about 4.5 tons without applying any fertilizer. At tri-state rates, had a 6-ton average, and that was no different than applying crop removal statistically, where if we only applied at 50% crop removal, we lost about 0.5 ton. So 5.5 tons with only 50% of crop removal applied, but that fertilizer was definitely critical. Take those 3 harvest years there. So we took out the planting year of 2009, so 10, 11, and 12. If you look at no fertilization versus fertilization, we picked up 3 tons of hay over those 3 years, a ton each year on average. Now adding sulfur, increased yield, elemental sulfur was significant over just tri-state, but sulfur did improve yields. And we'll look at that here a little more. About 6.7 tons with elemental sulfur. When we look at 4 cuttings in 2013, total yield, as that stand got older, sulfur became more critical. And also we saw greater losses in total yield as the stand aged without fertilization. So without fertilization, that final year only grew 3.5 tons without fertilizer, 5.1 tons at tri-state. If we did tri-state plus sulfur, we kicked that up significantly to a 6-ton average, 17% more with that elemental sulfur application, which was all sulfur applied at planting, or 22% with that yearly sulfur application using gypsum. One thing to look at though is this alfalfa sulfur content. It's not quite to the point where we'd be worried about it, but if it gets much higher, we actually have about too much sulfur in this forage if it's a high alfalfa diet. Now, if we're blending it off, like 50% corn silage in the diet, 20% alfalfa, you're not going to have a problem. But if it's a high alfalfa diet, 50-60% alfalfa, or if you're putting free choice alfalfa bales in, feeding cattle that way, or feeding beef cattle, and all they're getting is this forage, it could be too high a sulfur. You notice we're about 3.5 to 0.3 to 0.4% sulfur, which can cause some issues with rumen microbial activity at that high sulfur content with that flue gas gypsum. Now we probably just need to back that sulfur rate off. If you remember, it applied like 250 pounds of sulfur, and that's just way too much when 80 is about what you need and about what crop removal would be. So when we look at sulfur content, it is a little bit higher in the elemental sulfur in the later years, no difference in 2009, which we actually wouldn't expect because elemental sulfur was put on right before planting, and it almost takes an entire year for elemental sulfur to become plant available, where that flue gas gypsum sulfur is readily available to the crop. But not only did sulfur show up as in the feed, it's also a critical element of making protein. Many of our proteins include include a sulfur portion in that molecule, and we saw a significant protein increase by fertilizing with sulfur. Went from about 18% to 20 to 22% crude protein with that sulfur application. So do we need to give more attention to sulfur? Yes, I would say we do, because as the Clean Air Act continues to be invoked and we clean up the air, we clean up the atmosphere, it results in lower sulfur emissions, lower sulfur deposition on fields through rainfall. And I'm going to hazard a guess without some research data, but I'm going to guess that it's actually more critical for many of you across Indiana, just based on some differences we've seen in soybean work. Soybean work coming out of Indiana is showing some critical advantages to sulfur. We're not seeing that consistent advantage yet here in Ohio on soybeans. Now, many of our alfalfa trials have shown that advantage to a sulfur application, especially in crude protein and some in yield. So I'm going to hazard a guess that it's actually a little bit more critical for those of you in Indiana to look at potentially applying sulfur. The use of fertilizers contain little sulfur that we're using, unless you're using manure. Manure can be a great sulfur source. Higher forage yields equals more nutrients removed. So if we're removing 6 tons of alfalfa at 5 to 6 pounds of sulfur per ton of dry matter, that 6-ton alfalfa crop's removing 30 to 36 pounds of sulfur each year. And that's about what we should probably be looking at replacing. There's factors that increase the likeliness of, basically all of those increase that likeliness of sulfur being that place to invest a few dollars from your fertilizer budget. When we look at deposition and things that are changing, this here is a total sulfur deposition map looking at pounds deposited. If you think about the fact that we are utilizing about 36 pounds of sulfur each year, in 2015, if you look across most of Indiana, it's down here in the blue at that 2 to 4 pounds of sulfur. There's a portion over here of Ohio where Chris is from. We're depositing about 9 pounds of sulfur per acre per year. You go back to 2001, that is an entire red belt across the rust belt of the country. There was a lot of natural sulfur deposition, 18, 20 some pounds. So when we look at sulfur data, we really have to look at current research studies to determine if it's beneficial to our area. And really, I'd recommend, if you're questionable on that sulfur side, start doing on-farm trials like Chris talked about. Basically set up multiple strips throughout the field where you go out and you collect yield data where you applied that sulfur versus didn't, and watch. Because at some point, if your area of the country isn't there yet, you're going to hit a tipping point where sulfur will be a beneficial nutrient. Look for sulfur deficiencies. If you don't apply sulfur, definitely go out and scout. And look for that yellowing of the plant. Sulfur deficient plant on the left is much shorter than the plant on the right, going to have more spindly stems, weak growth. It's also going to have a yellow hue to it. Now, you got to be careful when you look at a yellow alfalfa plant that it's not insect damage. Potato leafhopper can yellow that alfalfa plant very easily and can be a little bit confusing as to what is causing that yellowing. But I'm seeing more and more alfalfa fields where sulfur isn't applied, that if we do a tissue test, we then find out that we truly are deficient in sulfur. So kind of a summary of that study, the sulfur increased sulfur content, increased yields in the harvested forage, increased crude protein. The alfalfa yields increased 8 to 9% over the life of the stand. Crude protein increased about 2% by adding that sulfur and that recommendation of utilizing potassium and phosphorus fertilization. Marginal returns were highest for treatments containing sulfur. So if you're going to spend money on that fertilizer, maybe consider spending that sulfur dollar. And yield response to gypsum was likely due to the sulfur, not the calcium. Oop. Not sure if I can go back. Nope. Thanks, Chris. And potassium deficient alfalfa, as we start to look at potassium here, we need to look for if we have spots where we don't have that yield, it's yellow dotting on the oldest leaves and around the outer edges. Again, this is yellowing, which is kind of that same idea as sulfur, but the difference is in potassium, we have dots. It's not the entire plant. It has that general hue of yellowing. And it's also out here around the outer margins of the plant instead of across the entire leaf. Potassium deficiencies, there's moderate and then severe deficiencies. Moderate's just going to be speckling, almost looks like a little bit of insect feeding, where that severe deficiency, those speckles basically join together around the outer margins of that plant. Typically, you'll keep that mid vein of the alfalfa leaf, will keep that green color to it while the leaf turns yellow. Soil testing, plant analysis are important. Chris kind of went over that portion on soil testing. Plant analysis, usually we're going to sample that top 6 inches at harvest, and it indicates that there's adequate potassium fertilization, less than 2%. Potassium indicates insufficient potassium for winter hardiness. So stands that need to overwinter, potassium is critical for root growth and winter hardiness for that plant to overwinter and come back for you next year. Low potassium fields, we often find more crown death in. Optimum yields usually contain around 2.5% potassium in that upper 6 inches. The record yields when testing some of those forage entries for yield contests, 10 ton per acre non-irrigated alfalfa had a potassium content of 3%. So they had even higher fertility in those fields. Something to keep in mind, don't look at your forage test to determine what the potassium content is and if your fields are good. Potassium is a leachable nutrient. If it happens to get rained on, heavy dews, we can actually lose some of that potassium out of the plant. Now, if we have really high potassium at harvest, it's a good indicator that we have enough potassium in our soil, but also that upper 6 inches is what the recommendations are based off of. So if we take a 12-inch tall plant and we harvest the whole thing for forage, that's not going to give us the same results as just harvesting the upper 6 inches. Potassium deficiencies are going to hurt more than yield. They hurt persistence. So the life of that stand, the number of shoots per plant, and shoot yield. Deficiencies reduce root starch storage, which is critical for overwintering. Potassium will actually reduce protein concentration in the roots and the plant and results in poor survival and slower shoot regrowth after harvest. Fertilizers increase nodule activities. And here we have a study where we look at the amount of potassium applied per acre and then the number of nodules. So why are nodules important? Nodules are what produce that nitrogen for us. If we don't have nodule production, we're going to have lower crude protein, lower yields. And we notice here we got to 64 to 107 pounds of K2O per acre. In this study, we really saw bigger nodules and more nodules, which produce more nitrogen. And on average, if we're applying about 300 pounds of K2O for an average 6-ton crop harvested, we're going to maintain that nodule health. If we drop under this 100, and we can definitely see in this study, there was a continuous trend increase. Didn't really have high enough levels to truly tell what happens to that 200-300 pounds. Looking at that winter kill, one thing you can do if you have limited fertilizer dollars is provide additional potassium in the fall. So doing a fall application of potassium will get luxury consumption, which improves those roots for overwintering. Yes, we maybe starve them during the summer, has slower regrowth, but we can improve that root system for winter survivability. This is just looking at adding 100 pounds of K2O versus none per acre. I know it's an old study, but the concept still applies today. And when we look at stand density in that decline, if we don't apply potassium, we go from about 100% stand density down to about 10-15% over that 7-year lifespan of that alfalfa field. With potassium applied, we went from 98 to 100% down to 90% stand density over the years. It's also important in mixed stands, but the thing you have to remember is alfalfa is the crop we have to fertilize for. So grasses don't need as much potassium as alfalfa, but we have to make sure that we meet that alfalfa needs in the mixed stand, or we could have those winter survivability issues. Alfalfa takes up or removes large amounts of potassium from the soil. Fertilization is essential to high yields, stand longevity, winter hardiness. You need to fertilize to optimize forage yields, and that's concentration. If you tissue test, should be 2 to 3% potassium. Applications pre-plant and then following harvest. You need to spread out your fertilizer dollars. You can actually fertilize after each harvest, and that can give you some benefits of that little bit of nitrogen if you're applying some phosphorus to green that grass crop up each time you harvest, and apply the recommended rates and avoid luxury consumption. Potassium's a nutrient that if we apply a lot of it to a forage crop, we can actually drive that potassium level very high in the harvested crop. And then we're removing more potassium than needed. It doesn't improve plant health, and it also doesn't increase our profitability when that plant's in luxury consumption. Moving into phosphorus. Phosphorus is another critical nutrient for alfalfa. U.S. alfalfa and hay yields keep increasing. We need to meet nutrient uptake and removal. It's critical for root development, general phosphorus nutrition. So there's a lot of phosphorus utilized in plant functions. Phosphorus boosts hay yields, recovery and quality. Inputs, frequency, and source can matter. We need to make sure we include all those, especially including all the sources of phosphorus if we're using manures, just for environmental concerns, and it's required as a balanced nutrient. Again, we see phosphorus is critical for nodule weight. Now, we're probably not going to apply 510 pounds of P2O5 per acre like this shows on a yearly basis. That's way more than what we actually remove. But as you see, from 0 to 510 pounds, we increase nodule growth, nodule weight, and the number of nodules on that alfalfa crop. Phosphorus improves alfalfa growth and recovery. As we look across these zeros down here in red, then you go up to 6 times up here in blue, and we look at shoot weight days after cutting. The more phosphorus that was applied, the quicker regrowth the crop saw, and alfalfa develops more shoots after cutting with adequate phosphorus. So no application again is down here at 0, 1, 2, and 6 times. Recommended rates are the other colors, and you see that phosphorus again is critical for that regrowth. So it goes to that idea that we need balanced nutrients, not just picking one when we have limited fertilizer dollars. 6-year study. Now this is actually coming out of, no, this is the one coming. Yeah, this is the one coming out of the South. So it's a 6-year study, and it's investigating some different phosphorus application strategies. In all applications over the 6-year study, 600 pounds of P2O5 were applied. That is a lot to apply at one time. Definitely could have some environmental concerns about losses. So that last treatment, which is 600 pounds, one time pre-plant, probably isn't ideal, but the other 2 strategies, 100 pounds of P2O5 every year or 200 pounds every other year, could be potential ones to consider. When we look across this study, it's interesting to see that application method mattered here, and so did rates. So between 100 pounds every year and 200 pounds every other year, we actually saw increased yields by applying that 200 pounds every other year instead of that yearly fertilization program. Or applying 600 pounds that seeding year actually had the highest yields. But beyond that, something to take note of here is that fact that knifing in the phosphorus at a 6-inch depth, either every 2 years or one big application on year 1 and having that application last for 6 years, really increased yields. Why is that? Alfalfa is a deep-rooted crop. So when it gets dry out, that alfalfa can continue to grow. But if at lower nutrient depths, we're deficient in nutrients, the alfalfa doesn't grow as well, even though there's some moisture down deep. So by putting that phosphorus in at 6 inches, that kept nutrients down in that lower rooting zone. As the soils dried out, the crop continued to grow because it had nutrients and water. Where if we put all of our nutrients on the soil surface, we don't see that same yield response because that top dries out, the roots kind of stop growing in the top, and they're mining nutrients down deep where there are not as many nutrients for that plant to find. So maybe looking at ways, if we do tillage before planting, putting on a heavy amount of phosphorus and potassium before planting, tilling that soil, turning those nutrients down deep as you can, could be beneficial for improving crop yield in dry conditions, especially with alfalfa. And then throughout, if we need to apply management, nutrients, apply those on top, because we probably don't want to go in and knife into our alfalfa crops and risk cutting them at a 6-inch depth and breaking those crowns up. But it shows a real advantage here to putting this phosphorus down deep if you're going to be growing alfalfa. 6 years, the response here, year 1 versus year 6 on yield, 100 pounds applied every year. We saw much greater yield on year 6 than year 1. This field was deficient to start with again, kind of the same thing at 200 pounds. We saw yields increase. But when all 600 pounds were put on in early years, we saw much greater yields in year 1 compared to year 6. So we had those nutrients available for plant growth early on, and towards the end, soil tests were probably actually getting low because we didn't continue to apply the nutrients that were needed and spoon feed that crop. There was some luxury consumption. But also, if you think about seeding year, we have more plants, more yield potential. If we look at the typical tail off of a forage crop, and by applying that nutrients early on, we applied it when we had the most crowns and plants and greatest yield potential. So if you think about that, if you're trying to decide fields to fertilize, it may actually be more critical to fertilize those younger stands that are only a year old or so versus the stands you plan to tear up next year with the limited fertilizer dollar. Effects of phosphorus fertilization on soil concentrations here as we look across this study. It started at 7 parts per million. And if we fertilized every year, we saw this increase in, so check over here on the left, we saw increases in soil phosphorus concentration with that 115 pounds. So we actually were not removing all the phosphorus we were putting on. We were building the soils. Preparing the soil before planting is definitely critical. Prior to planting, incorporate phosphorus for establishment of strong root systems, promoting rapid recovery, and maintaining healthy stands, and provide balanced nutrients. Make sure we have adequate potassium in our area. Calcium's never been an issue, or magnesium. And then also consider sulfur and boron, which we'll touch on boron here towards the end. And before you do anything, make sure you correct that pH problem. Over here, we can see a low phosphorus versus adequate phosphorus field. And you can see that stand density based on the researcher's hand difference. You have about a 6 to 8 inch difference in alfalfa height, where we had adequate phosphorus versus not enough. This study was done in Indiana, looking at the idea of balanced nutrients for what the crop is removing versus omitting one of the nutrients. It's a little bit hard to tell from this picture, but you can see back here in the back where we applied no potassium versus 75 pounds of phosphorus. We have a little bit better growth than where no potassium was applied, but not as good as over where we applied 200 pounds of potassium. The big difference is when that potassium was applied, we had a much darker green crop where phosphorus definitely impacted plant height. Balanced phosphorus and potassium nutrition is essential for optimal yield and stand maintenance. If you look down here at the bottom, mostly focus on that root health, where we have low P and low K. You can see those small spindly roots, poor root system, poor overwintering, poor crown survivability, poor regrowth. If you look over on the right, where we had high to adequate P and K, you got probably twice as thick a taproot and 2 to 3 times as many shoots coming off of that crown. Diagnosis of phosphorus deficiencies can be challenging. They're distinct. They're seldomly observed, though. Soil testing is critical prior to planting. Regularly afterwards, if you have 5 or 6 year alfalfa stands, you should really test on year 3 or 4 of that stand and see where your soil tests are at to continue that stand life. Tissue analysis can be beneficial. Top third of the plant is the recommendation for phosphorus, or that top 6 inches on an 18-inch plant. And you want that concentration to be between 0.25 and 0.4% phosphorus. Manures, I want to touch on this here for a little bit, because if you're growing forages, you may have livestock, and manure can be a great nutrient for forages from your livestock, but there's also some challenges we'll touch on. Alfalfa can use the phosphorus, the potassium, the sulfur, and all the micronutrients that are in manure. Manure helps to boost soil biology, and the manure is going to need to go somewhere, so we can put it on our forage fields. That's great. That crop can uptake it. If we want to put that on in the fall after 4th cutting, that's honestly the best time, and it helps with overwintering and survivability. If for some reason we have to go out and winter spread, if we don't have that ability to hold that, our forage fields maybe aren't actively growing, but at least they have good cover to help hold that manure on the field and prevent runoff and leaching. Alfalfa is also an excellent sink for soil nitrogen and for manure nitrogen. It just gets a little bit lazy when we give it more nitrogen. If it's an alfalfa grass mix, though, we do see some yield advantages to applying some liquid manure after each cutting and letting that crop utilize the nitrogen. Some disadvantages though, when you apply that manure to alfalfa mixed fields, alfalfa grass mixes instead of pure alfalfa is ideal because that grass can utilize the nitrogen. So less than 50% alfalfa, grass does respond to nitrogen fertilization. So manure is a great use there. Manure can reduce potential stand damage. How do we overcome that? If we're going to be driving across with heavy equipment. So we want to apply manure as soon as possible after cutting and before new leaves appear. Really, in order to do that, though, we need to be thinking about fields that we harvest for silage or baleage. Those fields we get across sooner, a day or two earlier. There isn't as much regrowth, so we don't do as much damage. Trafficking those new shoots, where our wheels run and we break off those new shoots, basically we set them back 4 days or so, and we also utilize more of that root reserve for regrowth. Of course, don't drive on wet soils. Compaction can be the death of alfalfa. So we want to not drive across wet soils. We only want to apply about 3,000 gallons per acre of liquid manure. We want to make sure it's broadcast evenly. Injecting right now is not recommended for alfalfa crops. We need to do some more research on that. There's grassland applicators that are available coming out of Europe. They use a straight disc that work great in grasses, but we're kind of worried about cutting those alfalfa crowns with these grassland applicators. So finding some of those and doing some research on alfalfa crown reductions due to those applicators is going to be important before we start doing that any sort of widespread or make that recommendation. So for now, we'd recommend just spraying that nutrient on top and try to keep your tankers light. Those 7,000 gallon manure tankers can do a lot of damage across an alfalfa field. So filling more often, utilizing smaller tankers on alfalfa would probably be a good idea. Some other things to think about: Johne's disease can be transferred in manure. So after a manure application, we don't want to use that next cutting for young stock. It can also increase bacteria counts in the forage. If there's really high rates of manure used, it could reduce palatability if some of it's still on the plant at harvest. And alfalfa, manured alfalfa contains more ash a lot of times, so cutting a little bit higher minimizes that contamination of the manure in the forage. Can also get increased weed pressure. If we have weeds in our manure, we're actually planting those in our forage fields, not ideal. And manure application in the final year of the stand may lead to some excessive nutrient losses at termination of that crop as it breaks down and dies. But also that can be a good time to apply because you have that cover and then you don't have to worry about some of these problems such as Johne's disease and increased bacteria. Boron, to touch on our last nutrient here. Boron, I call it essential-ish because it's very important for crop growth, but it's needed in really low levels. Ideally, soil test really can't be used, but if you do soil test and you look at boron, you need about 1 part per million for alfalfa versus a 0.5 part per million for other forage crops. Alfalfa needs more boron, but can easily become toxic. So close to 1 part per million, tissue testing in the upper third of the plant is sufficient. Toxicities can happen at 30 to 50 parts per million. I've actually seen instances where somebody messed up the decimal point in boron application. So instead of applying 5 pounds of boron to the acre, instead of applying 2 pounds of boron to the acre, they applied 10. And when they applied 10, we had 100 part per million boron. And they were able to find a market for that hay. They sold it to somebody that was going to be mixing it. Typically, their hay was going into horses, and that was high enough that in a horse diet that was eating all hay, we could have had toxic forages and made those horses sick. So luckily, they were able to find a livestock market that was going to run that hay through a TMR and dilute the boron out. But that can be a real concern because application rates of 2 pounds per acre improve yields, but anything over that, especially if somebody messes up a decimal point and puts in 20 pounds to the acre in the fertilizer mix, can make that forage toxic. Look for deficiencies. Boron, instead of being yellow, is more of a whitish color on the upper leaves instead of the lower leaves. Potassium shows up on lower leaves. We're looking for boron toxicity, and it doesn't show up here for some reason as well. This leaf here has that white margin around the outside. The whole plant isn't white like a deficient plant. Down here on these bottom lower leaves, you can see that white margin, which is boron toxicity, and that's just applying 10 pounds of boron per acre on a new stand. Boron toxicity can also show up in grasses. 10 pounds per acre boron, we can get toxicity in fescue. you see this tip on these plants is white and dying. That's that toxicity to boron. Shows up a little bit better here in orchard grass. The tips of the grass plant has that white dead look to it after that 10 pound per acre boron application. Very similar in Timothy. Timothy's even more sensitive. So the take home message is that boron's important, but make sure you don't go over that 2 pounds per acre. When we get up into 10, 20 pounds per acre, we can have toxic plants, kill the plants and make livestock sick. Last thing to touch on here is nitrogen. We've been doing some work here in Ohio looking at fall oats and nitrogen recommendations. I wouldn't directly apply this to some of the other cereal grains. We have some studies starting in on that, actually looking at nitrogen and sulfur on cereal rye in the spring. But some of these same trends do apply. As in here in the middle where no nitrogen is applied, we have a very weak stand, very yellow. Got to find out that's low in crude protein and very low tonnage. And then on each side of that, it had 50 pounds or 100 pounds of nitrogen, much greener, lusher crop. When we look at this, these oats were planted after a wheat crop. We can see our nitrogen recovery ability. So where no nitrogen was applied, we actually recovered about 8 pounds of nitrogen per acre, only yielded a quarter ton of oats. Putting on 50 pounds of nitrogen, we actually didn't manage to recover it all. We only recovered 30 pounds of nitrogen from that and yielded about a ton of dry matter. At 100 pounds of nitrogen application rate, we recovered 111 pounds of nitrogen and 2 3/4 tons dry matter yield. And this is with mid-August planted oats. So if we have a good oat stand, we can recover all the nitrogen and then some. If we don't have a good stand, we may not recover all the nitrogen we put on. As we look over time, this is a chart here of seeding rate date and then nitrogen rate over time. We can see that the later we plant oats, the lower the yields, and that the later we go in this year, and we'll see later on, it's not always the case, that 46, so 50 to 100 pounds of nitrogen when we get into that mid-August planting basically yield the same. So the higher nitrogen rates are more important with an early planting because we have greater yield potential with a longer growing season. Fall oats from 21, stuff just grew slow. We actually didn't harvest the majority of our oats trials until after they'd been frosted once. Oats can stand frost though, which is one of the nice things about them and allows for great winter forages. In this study, we actually upped our nitrogen rates. So instead of going from 0 to 100, we went from 50 to 140 pounds of nitrogen. And what we saw was that 100 to 140 pounds of nitrogen with the early planting date did not increase yield. But then when we went to a mid-August planting, we actually saw a yield increase with 140 pounds of nitrogen. You may ask, why is that? That's because of when the rainfalls came. So that early planting got very dry. It went to head early on. It didn't have the rain to go with the nitrogen that was applied, where that mid-August planting caught more September rains, grew more tons, was able to utilize that nitrogen better because it had moisture. So really, when we look at cereals, 50 to 100 pounds of nitrogen is probably a good current recommendation for forage cereals. If you're growing cereal rye, though, that recommendation is more like 50 to 75, depending on your soils. Remember to include all nitrogen sources, including your manure, because if we go too high, remember, cereal grains like to fall down with lots of nitrogen. Does anybody have any questions for Chris and I?
All right, thank you, Chris and Jason. So I do not have any questions in the chat box currently, but if you guys have any questions, feel free to unmute and ask if you want. There's few enough of us that you should be able to do that. Again, I've put the link in the chat box. If you could please fill that out. And then also just launched a poll. If you could complete that for us as well, we would appreciate it. So any questions for Chris or Jason on anything we've discussed today? All right, I'm not seeing anything at the moment, Jason and Chris, but I greatly appreciate the information that you've given us. It helps give us some guidelines to kind of move forward with in this coming year, especially with these increasing prices and things like that. So there's been some interesting discussions this last week at the Fort Wayne Farm Show about some of these fertilizer prices and such. So it's always interesting to hear kind of the difference between the corn and soybeans and then what we should be looking at for our hay fields and pastures as well. So
I thank you too. I think you did an outstanding job, gentlemen, and I appreciate you coming over, taking the long trip from Ohio to get over here today.
Well, we appreciate the invitation, and the contact information is there. If anyone has any questions, would like to follow up, either of us be happy to answer questions later on.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. If there are no more questions, we appreciate you being on today. Again, we've got another session next week on kind of rental prices, grazing pastures, renting buildings, things like that is going to be our topic next week. So we look forward to seeing you next week on Friday, January 28th, for our 6th Forage Forum Friday. So, all right. So if there are no other questions or things like that, again, please remember to fill out the survey that's in the chat as well as complete the polls, and have a wonderful weekend, everybody.
Thanks for letting us come present, and